Hello, my holy brothers and sisters. Who's in the house? Where are you tuning in from? Another crazy day. Another day of unprecedented occurrences. Every day now. Things are happening that have never happened before. What are we to make of this? How are we going to function? You know, I shared a little talk that the Jewish Journal is going to put out, a little video that I made for them earlier today. And I said, look, the world needs three things from us. It needs deeds, it needs Torah, and it needs prayer. Deeds, listen, the deeper we get into this pandemic, the more there are going to be vulnerable members of our society who are really in trouble. I mean, there's people who are in high-risk categories because they're old, because they have diabetes or respiratory illness or they're immune compromised, whatever it is, and it's dangerous for them to go to the store. And so at some point they're going to need water, they're going to need groceries. Maybe there's a delivery service that can bring it to them. Or maybe, my friend, you hearing this message now, maybe it's you. Maybe you're the person who's going to be tasked because you're young and healthy and that you can make that errand and go to the supermarket and get them the water or the food that they need, you know, and wash your hands and wash your hands and wash your hands over again. But doing errands for people may become a life-saving enterprise. Torah, we're doing it now. Thank God we live in a time where we can engage in Torah study virtually. I mean, it's the interconnectedness of the world that has perhaps set the stage for such a fast-moving pandemic, although it was a much slower-moving world at the time of the what was known as the Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with Spain. It was the Spanish press that reported it right at the end of the First World War. But at any rate, it was a deadly, deadly epidemic that killed many people, and they didn't have the means to transfer information that we have now. So thank God we can engage in Torah learning like this, even when our synagogues and yeshivas and other physical institutions of learning are closed. We can continue our Torah learning in this way. And as I've taught many times on this show, when we learn and share Torah, it is a distinct and real benefit to the world. And then our prayers. Who knows, my friends, but that the world right now is balanced on a razor edge where things could go terrible or things could improve much quicker. And perhaps it is our prayers and our mitzvahs and our learning that just tips the balance, that little bit that it needed. So when we pray these days, we may not be able to gather in our houses of worship, but one can always pray at home. And when we pray, let us be like we learned yesterday, the way that Rav Ashi observed Rav Kahana when he would pray. During a time of suffering, he wouldn't dress up, but he would come before the Lord like a slave before his master with his hands clasped together. Right now, we don't extend our hands out to other people. We clasp our hands together and we supplicate for healing. What we're trying to do is create a home for God in this world so that God will come and occupy it. And in a sense, if we're asking God to come visit us in our home, it's like we're living, all of us, this world, our earth that we share, there's illness in it now, right? It's like the world is sick and we need a healing visit from our Creator, right? And so if we ask, if we beseech, if our prayers are sincere enough, maybe we'll get that visit and this thing will blow over faster. And I'll add, for our audience here, for our teaching, you're used to me, we've been learning together for a while. As bad as this is, and it's bad, it's serious, people are dying, people are so indisposed, people who are living check to check and they're not sure if their employment is going to last because they work for a small business and the small business is not making money. I mean, there's all kinds of real challenges that are emerging from this pandemic. But with God's help, it will pass and then we'll get past it, right? But when we think about other plagues that we're not only, as quick to catch, to infect others as this one, but that when infected, the mortality rate could be so high. The Black Plague in the medieval times, Ebola, other diseases that are just so much more mortal, right? This one is relatively light. It could have been much worse. So the question is, now that we've had a very clear shot across the bow, using naval terms from wartime, we've had a real clear shot across the bow. Are we going to learn our lesson? There's a video going around now. Bill Gates gave a TED Talk in 2015 and interviews in 2018. Bill Gates is a brilliant man, the founder of Microsoft, and he could see at that time that we were not preparing for a pandemic, and that a pandemic could be so much deadlier than the deadliest of wars. And societies, all countries take seriously, right, that you have to be prepared for war. God forbid, you have an enemy come and attack your shores and come and attack your people. We have to be prepared for that. But we weren't prepared enough for this pandemic. So, as we're tasking our government to be more prepared next time, and that definitely is what the government needs to do, but we should also be asking ourselves, what lessons are we learning right now that we can take once we get out of this, and God willing we'll get out of it, but we should have a level of preparedness forever, which is going to be a little higher than it was before. So what are the lessons that we're learning now that are going to help us be more prepared next time? All right, let's get into our learning. We're holding by page 11, Daf Yud Aleph of Tractate Shabbos. We're still in chapter 1. On this page, we're going to enter the third mishna of our learning. But today, as I mentioned yesterday, we're going to continue with some of the wisdom sayings of the colorfully named Rava bar Mechasya, who taught in the name of Rav Chama bar Gurya, who taught in the name of Rav. So we had a list of wisdom teachings that we began yesterday, and now we're going to add 3 more teachings of Rav, brought down by Rav Chama bar Gurya, which were brought down by Rava bar Mechasya. Number 1. In a Jewish town, right? A town where there's enough Jews there and they don't fear the Gentile authority, right? So either because we're living in a Jewish country, be it in Israel or we're in America, where we're free and we're not really afraid that a Jew-hating government is going to come and pass laws that restrict us, that don't restrict others. So if in a time of safety, in a place of safety, for a Jewish community, the synagogue should be taller than the dwellings of the Jews, right? The synagogue should be the tallest structure compared to dwellings. This doesn't talk about businesses, right? So there can be a business tower that's taller than the synagogue, that's fine. But if a Jewish community has the liberty to construct as they want to, so the synagogue should be taller than anybody's house. Otherwise, considered disrespectful. Somebody is more arrogant, right? They want their structure to be more grand than the synagogue. Or the community didn't invest enough to say, look, the place where we gather to pay our respects to God, we should invest and make that structure nice, right? And large and grand. And at least in terms of height, okay? Synagogues always have to run capital campaigns, right? And members are like, oh, they're asking us for money again. They just want to make the building good. Isn't it enough that we're members and we have programs? We should be paying for that. Does it really have to be a nice building? And the Talmud says, yes, it has to be a good building. They're not telling you it has to have, fancy artwork and fancy architecture and fancy this and fancy that. But this idea that it should be the tallest building in town compared to people's homes does extend a little bit beyond just height, right? You want the community to feel that their synagogue matters and that they invest in it. If, however, you live in a place where the Gentile authorities don't want the synagogue to be taller than their homes and the Gentile homes. And so it's a time and a place of danger for the Jews. So then you can disregard this law. It does not apply. Number two, another teaching for today of Rav, right, but brought down through this chain of transmission through Rav Chama bar Gurya to Rava bar Mechasya. And he has, it's a very colorful, so I'm actually going to read this to you. It's a ranking, if you're talking about, well, you know, sometimes we live under a Gentile authority and it's dangerous for us and we have to be careful. So he's going to look at the relative desirability of living under certain people. Whose authority, if you have to live under somebody else's authority but your own, so who is it preferable to live under? You know, as if, okay, you're going to emigrate away from your country and you're trying to decide where to live, so who should you want to live under? Now, this is an analysis from 2,000 years ago. Might not apply exactly the way they wrote it out then in terms of now. Not 2,000 years ago, more like 1,400 years ago. It's in the Talmud, so this is a commentary on the Mishnah. So this was, you know, this was finished by about the year 600 or 700, right? And some would say 500. All right, so Rava bar Mechasya said that Rav Chama bar Gurya said that Rav said it is preferable to be under the yoke of Ishmael and not under the yoke of a stranger, meaning the Romans, right? So when you talk about Ishmael, you're talking about the descendants of Abraham's older son, Yishmael, as opposed to the descendants of Yitzhak, who we are. The Jews are the descendants of Yitzhak. Who are the descendants of Yishmael? So this is the Arab people, right? The descendants of Yishmael are basically the Arabs in the Middle East, and it's better to live under their authority than under the Roman authority, right? Because the Roman authority could be so much more cruel to the Jews than the Arab people at that time. And it is preferable to live under a stranger, meaning the Romans, and not under a chabar, right? So who was the chabar? The chabar were the priests of the fire religion, of the Zoroastrian religion that existed at that time in the Persian Empire. It is better to live under, now this is weird, but it is better to live under a chabar than it is to live under a Torah scholar. What? You'd rather live under some fire priest? You know, and we'd rather live under, and it would have been better to live under Romans than under the fire priest, but better one of these fire priests than a Torah scholar? That's crazy talk. So here we're understanding that Rav is being a little bit metaphoric, and he's talking about relative dangers in different situations. So what does he mean by that? Because one who offends a Torah scholar who is greater than he, right? And he's actually talking to Torah scholars, right? If a Torah scholar is trying to figure out where to live, dangerous for him to live under the authority of another Torah scholar. Now, not really, but what does he mean? He says, because if one offends a Torah scholar who is greater than he, the scholar will be exacting with him and he will be punished at the hand of heaven, right? So this is all about giving offense. Who is more dangerous to you if you give offense, right? So they're saying it was more dangerous to give offense to a Roman governor, you know, than to an Arab governor at that time. And now he's saying it's more dangerous to give offense to a Torah scholar even than to one of the fire priests of the Zoroastrian religion of the Persian Empire at that time. Why? More dangerous because it shouldn't really be more dangerous because is a Jew really going to have to live in fear if he's living under a Torah scholar? Of course not. But if you should come to offend a Torah scholar, that's very dangerous, because a Torah scholar has a hotline to heaven, as it were, right? And just as Jacob, when he was running away from his father-in-law Lavan with his wives and his children, and he, and then Lavan came and chased him and said, somebody stole the idols from my house. And Jacob said, well, that wasn't us. if anybody has one of your idols, that person can die as far as I'm concerned. And he didn't know that his wife, his most beloved wife, Rachel, had taken one of these idols from her father, perhaps to try to, save him from worshiping idols. But the fact is, she had it. And Jacob, didn't do it on purpose, but he cursed his own wife. He did it unknowingly. He never would have done it if he knew that she had it. But he issued that curse. And maybe it's a coincidence, but the fact is, his wife, Rachel, ended up dying quite young when she was giving birth to Benjamin. So you have to be very careful lest you give offense to a genuine Torah scholar, because if they get mad at you and end up cursing you, big problem. But it is better to live under a Torah scholar and not under an orphan or a widow, because orphans and widows are easily insulted, and God promised to hear the cries of orphans and widows and punish those who offend orphans and widows, right? So on the one hand, you don't want to live under these people because they might be harsh with us. On the other hand, if you're talking about who's capable of imposing harm on you, not just because they have an army and they could send you to jail and do whatever, temporal authorities do, earthly authorities do, but Torah scholars, and even more than Torah scholars, orphans and widows, have this hotline to heaven, and if you offend them, beware, right? So that's the second teaching that we have today. From Rav, transmitted by Rav Chama bar Gurya, transmitted by Rava bar Mechasya. Another one that he gives is the ranking of illnesses, so very timely today, and I'll just read that one for you as well. And Rava bar Mechasya said that Rav Chama bar Gurya said that Rav said, it is preferable to suffer from any extended illness and not from an intestinal illness, right? Intestinal illness is much worse than other illnesses, even if they're extended. Similarly, it is preferable to suffer any pain, even if it is sharp and excruciating, as long as you don't have heart pain. Okay, I think anybody who's suffering from cardiovascular disease would agree with that. And it is better to have any slight ache rather than a headache. I get migraines from time to time, so I would definitely agree with this. And better to suffer any evil rather than to suffer having an evil wife. I'm just going to leave that alone. That was our teaching of Rav. And finally, Rava, that we're going to cover today, Rava bar Mechasya said, that Rav Chama bar Gurya said, that Rav said, even if all the seas would be ink, and the reeds that grow in swamps would be quills, and the heavens would be parchment, upon which the words would be written, and all the people were scribes, right? So, if all the seas were ink, and every reed that grew in a marsh was a quill to dip in the ink, and the heavens themselves would be, the expanse of the heavens would be the parchment that we're going to write on, and all the people in the world would act as scribes, right? So that's how much writing is going to be produced. Even if all that writing were to be produced, it would be insufficient to capture the mind of the government. What does that mean? Is the government so incredibly, inexplicably wise that all the writing in the world, all the writing fathomable in the world would not be enough to set down the wisdom of the government? Not exactly. Now there's a few interpretations of what this Gemara means, okay? That it is impossible to quantify the mind of the government. It is impossible to record the depth and nuance of the government. What does that mean? Let's go to some more recent rabbis, right? Some more recent commentators than the sages of the Talmud, to get a little help in understanding this. So, Rashi, the great 11th century commentator from France, Rashi says, simple meaning, the workings of the government are just too complex to be understood by anybody. When you think about this, it's not saying that the king or the president or whoever's in charge is so brilliant. What they're saying is that government has authority over so much of our lives and over so many people, and there's so many policy considerations going on and things that they're weighing, that it's just impossible for us to, look at the government and think we understand it. Just impossible to understand. Meiri, the commentator Meiri, says, give the government the benefit of the doubt. Because they've got so much going on and there's so many people that they're trying to govern, and so many competing considerations that we don't know about, that we don't have full information. So when we seek to practice the most enjoyable, right, of all spectator sports, criticizing the government for being such a pack of jackasses and corrupt idiots, we should take a step back and say, you know what? Maybe there's more going on than we know about, and something that looks like just a corrupt or evil decree, there might be more to it. It might be that the leader is corrupt or stupid or just really undermining the people in a way that should not be done. But it may also be that they're trying to do the best for us, and there's just a lot going on that we're not privy to. So, take a step back and give them the benefit of the doubt, says Meiri. Chidushe Haran says, because the government is so complicated and has so many competing concerns and is impossible to understand what they're really all about, so avoid dealings with them. Don't deal with the government. Don't get into contracts with the government. Don't buy and sell from the government. Avoid dealing with the government whenever possible. Sfas Emes says, it is what the passage means, that it is impossible to quantify the unquantifiable space of the government, impossible to capture the mind of the government. There's not enough ink or paper or pen or scribes enough in the universe to understand what the government is doing. Because it's like that, in fact, no king and no ruler, no dictator, no president, no sovereign is intelligent enough to rule any nation. Only God can do that, right? And so this is a reason for us to pray for the welfare and the wisdom of the government. Like, nobody can do that job. It's an impossible job to do correctly. Only God can do it. So we need to pray to God to give some inspiration and guidance to our elected leaders so that they do a good job, because nobody on their own could handle that. That is what, then that's what the Sfas Emes says. So it's a tough passage to understand, but it's worth keeping in mind, especially in modern times where governments are so large, right? I mean, if you think about how many employees the government has. Right? In the old days, okay, there was the king, he had his court, he had a certain number of people that went around the land enforcing the law, policemen, tax collectors, okay. But now it's like millions of people work for the government, and understanding all of them and how they're going to, impart policy to us, it's too complicated. It's impossible to understand. So we really have to pray for the wisdom of our leaders and the wisdom of their representatives who actually do the governing in our world. May the people running our country right now be inspired to make good decisions that will keep us safe. And let's say Amen. Okay, that brings us to a new Mishnah. So the first Mishnah, you'll recall, was about carrying and transferring on Shabbat. The second one was about not beginning certain activities because it's time for the afternoon prayer. And that was actually setting up this Mishnah that adjacent to nightfall on the eve of Shabbat, right? So late on Friday afternoon, there's certain things we don't want to do because somebody will come to violate Shabbos. And now it's just good to understand what is a rabbinic prohibition and what is a Torah prohibition, right? So a biblical prohibition, these are the laws that God gave us that we need to follow. Sometimes they're difficult to follow, difficult to understand, and sometimes the rabbis will pass laws not because they think something should be prohibited, right? They only pass a law, they only create a prohibition to save us from violating a biblical prohibition. It's important to understand that. Rabbis pass laws to save us from violating biblical prohibitions. And what they do not do is issue a decree upon a decree. Meaning, if they pass a rabbinic ordinance to save us from violating a biblical ordinance, they don't then pass an additional rabbinic ordinance to save us from violating a rabbinic ordinance. They don't issue a decree upon a decree. So the rabbis have to be careful only to pass laws that save us from violating biblical laws, but they can't pass laws upon laws just to save us from violating their own rabbinic laws. That's going to come into play here. So in this new Mishnah, which we're going to continue discussing for a few days as we bring in Talmudic commentary on the Mishnah, Gemara's the comment on the Mishnah, some of the passages, some of the provisions of this Mishnah are: a tailor may not carry his needle, right, may not go out with his needle right before Shabbat, right? And likewise, a scribe may not go out with his quill. And so then the problem is going to get raised right away. What do you mean he may not go out with his needle? We understand he can't carry his needle, which is the normal way that people would carry a needle, right? Because if he's, so he hasn't violated anything. If he goes outside of his house while it's still daytime on Friday, he hasn't violated anything. That's not, he hasn't violated a Torah law. But the rabbis say you can't do that, a rabbinic prohibition, so that he won't come to be carrying that needle once Shabbat has fallen, right? And why a tailor and his needle or a scribe and his quill? Because they're so accustomed to having that in their hands that they could easily forget, right, that it's there. Like they're not going to be mindful of it. Whereas, if a person finds himself carrying a crate of wine, and he's not a guy who loads trucks, so he's going to be mindful. Oh, I'm carrying this load of wine. Shabbat is coming. I got to make sure I get this down, and I'm not carrying on Shabbat. But people who carry things for a living, a tailor and his needle, he could easily forget that needle is in his hand. Then the question is asked, well, what if the needle is stuck in his jacket, right? You just position the needle through the cloth a little bit. So then, first of all, can you do that on Shabbat? Maybe, right? Maybe, because that's not carrying. If, for instance, if you make jewelry out of a key, if you make a key into a necklace, you actually could wear that on Shabbat because you can wear jewelry even though you cannot carry a key unless there's an Eruv. So a needle stuck in a piece of clothing, that's not really carrying the way it is if it's in someone's hand. And if somebody has to move a needle on Shabbat who's not a tailor and sort of puts it in the clothing, maybe that's going to be allowed. It's certainly not a biblical violation because that is not the way that people normally carry a needle, right? And so can a tailor carry the needle stuck in his cloth? He shouldn't do it, but he might not even be violating a rabbinic prohibition because we don't issue a decree on a decree. We don't want him carrying the needle in his hand because he might come to be carrying it after Shabbat begins. But a regular person can have that needle stuck in his clothing, and therefore the tailor could too, according to some opinions. In terms of the tailor carrying his needle in what is a usual way for him, but it would be an unusual way for other people, we're going to discuss that more tomorrow. For now, I just want to establish this principle that the rabbis don't issue a decree upon a decree. All right? A couple more provisions in this Mishnah that we're opening here on page 11, on Daf Yud Aleph. We don't shake our clothes on Shabbat to get lice out of them. You can see this is more the ancient world than where we're holding today. Why can't you shake your clothing? You can shake clothing, right? That's not, you can't wash clothing on Shabbat, but you can take your clothes on and off, and while that's happening, you could shake it. You haven't violated a biblical prohibition there. Why are they making a rabbinic prohibition that you can't shake your clothes to get the lice out of them? Because when you shake it, bugs could fall out. Not just lice, which is the questionable status, whether you can kill a louse on Shabbat, but some other creature, some bug, might fall out of your clothing. You'll be grossed out by it, and then you kill the bug. You can't kill on Shabbat, right? It's a form of slaughter, and that's a forbidden labor on Shabbat. Nor may we read by candlelight. This is going to be a whole category of prohibition. What? We can read. We can read on Shabbat. We can study Torah on Shabbat. Why can't we read by candlelight? Can you guess if you don't know already? It would seem like that's why we light the candles, right? We light candles before Shabbat so we have light to move around our dwelling so we're not in darkness, because after Shabbat begins, then we cannot kindle a light, for sure a biblically prohibited activity. So we light those candles before Shabbat begins so that we have light. So why can't we read by that light? We can walk around and not bump into things by that light. We're using that light, unlike the light of Hanukkah, right? The lights of Hanukkah are only for looking at. You don't light up a room with Hanukkah candles. But Shabbos candles, their whole purpose is to light up the house so we're not sitting in darkness. So why can't we read by the candles that we lit before Shabbat? Answer, because now that you're studying a thing closely near that candle, and then when the candle gets low, you might adjust the candle. You might move the candle. You might come to extinguish the candle by mistake, or in adjusting it, actually kindle a part of the candle that wasn't lit before. And that is the biblical prohibition that our rabbis are passing a law, a rabbinic prohibition, in order to save us from violating that biblical prohibition. So we're not allowed to read a book by candlelight on Shabbat because we might come to adjust that candle. Or in the old days, what especially they used was lamps, right? A lamp to us is like when you think about a genie, like rubbing a lamp so a genie doesn't come out. We shouldn't talk about genies, that's very un-Jewish. But just in terms of fictional literature, if you've seen a movie and it's one of those lamps that the genie comes out of, that's actually what a lamp was in the ancient world. It's, kind of a long object that has some oil in it, has a wick, and then that wick can burn and provide light for the room, right? Again, you wouldn't read by the light of that lamp, even if you lit it before Shabbat. And oil lamps, right, that's what oil lights were. They didn't have wax candles the way we do. They had wicks in oil, right? And there's a whole body of knowledge of what kind of oil may we use to light the Shabbos lights. And we read about that on Friday nights. But the point is, you can't read by that light, by that oil light, because you might come to adjust the lamp, and you might extinguish the fire, or you might light a piece that it shouldn't have been lit, that got lit. You can't move it, you can't adjust it. There it is. Okay, that's what I have for today. I'm gonna just glance over here to see if there's some questions in the comments. But in terms of our takeaway, especially at this time, right? This teaching of I can never say the whole thing, of Rava bar Mechasya in the name of Rav Chama bar Gurya in the name of Rav, that we cannot, it is impossible to contemplate the mind of the government. What we make of that, we listed, 4 different interpretations according to different interpreters, but either because the government is just too impossible to understand and they're dealing with information that we don't have, so maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt, or because even the leaders who are in charge of our government, they don't have enough intelligence to run the country, and we should be praying for their wisdom and their welfare so that they make good choices that affect all of us, or because government is so complicated and they make mistakes all the time, we should avoid dealing with the government whenever possible. Whichever way you want to interpret that passage, it's one worth remembering, right? So even if all the seas of the world were ink, and all the reeds in the marshes of the world were quills, and all the sky of the world was the parchment, and every person on earth was acting as a scribe, and they were recording everything that was going on and all the information that was available. Even so, we could not understand the mind of the government. So let's not be so quick to claim that we know everything that should be done. Let's be a little bit humble about that. And therefore, when we're critiquing the government or talking about who we should vote for or who should be elected, etc., let's be a little humble and realize that before we advocate for things, we should get as much information as possible so that we are intelligent and educated advocates for whatever our position is. Okay. Any comments over here? Any questions? I'm not seeing that. Annie says, why Solomon was so wise, right? I mean, to have a king that was capable, of ruling with wisdom, it's just a tremendous level of wisdom. And Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. And even he, by the end of his life, was making mistakes, right? Even he made mistakes. So let us all be a little bit humble in terms of telling people how they should be running the world, as if we know all the answers, right? Okay, my friends, all the best. It is great to be learning with you, doing this important activity of sharing Torah in a time of pain and suffering. It matters, you being here. It's a big mitzvah, shkoyach. May you be strengthened to be learning Torah again with us tomorrow. All the best and big love from LA.